Hi, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about chronic diseases and risk factors in South Asia. And chronic diseases are often referred to as non-communicable disease. So I'll jot that down up here. And the acronym NCD is often used, and you'll see that when you do reading. So we're going to talk about really three main themes. And these themes will dovetail with what we talked about last time in a conceptual framework or our cognitive map. So we spoke about the nature of the problem, and we want to understand the salient features of that health problem. We then talked about the importance of considering the local context as well as the global context. And then finally, the fun part of this course, we talked about the different ways we can respond to that problem. And that's what we'll cover today. So first, let's introduce the problem of chronic disease and talk about the features. So obviously, a good example of one chronic disease is cardiovascular disease and stroke. And that's the number one killer in the entire world if we think at a global level. But that's just one example. And the features of this cluster of diseases have a few characteristics that we'll jot down to warm us up. So the first is that they're not transmitted person to person. So even if an infectious agent is involved in the etiology or somewhere in the pathogenesis of a chronic disease, they're not transmitted like an infectious disease. Second, at least several of them have shared risk factors. And in addition, they will coexist with each other. So we'll often see patients who have more than one of the chronic diseases. Third, there is typically a long latency between the initial exposure and the ultimate disease. So this is a third important feature. Fourth, they're often chronic and long-lasting, and therefore, at times, that can equate to needing treatment for a long period of time. So long-lasting. And then finally, these are a cluster of conditions that not only cause premature mortality, but impair quality of life. And so we're going to jot down here both mortality and morbidity. And I'll mention right now that that's relevant to the health consequences of chronic diseases. But one thing we'll mention a little bit later is that the non-health consequences are also substantial. For example, the economic costs associated with chronic disease. So those are a few features. And let's think, before we go into detail about those, what is the magnitude of this problem? So I'll move over here to I'll jot down magnitude to orient us, and I'm going to draw a circle, and I'm going to ask you to imagine that in this circle, I'm plotting the distribution of all deaths in the world. So big global perspective, all the deaths, we're counting them up, and then we're going to put them into three categories. And if I asked you to do that, we would take about a quarter of those, and we'll just remind ourselves by putting that in red. And this part of the pie refers to the unfinished agenda of infectious diseases. We talked about that in the last module. So for short, I'll just write unfinished agenda, since you're familiar with that. The second component is about 10%, give or take a couple percent. And this is injuries, both intentional and unintentional. So that leaves this large chunk. So the chronic diseases and their risk factors are responsible for this entire portion, which actually represents about 65% of deaths from a big global perspective. So 65%, these are our chronic diseases. And again, this is the entire world. So if I was to ask you to think of a representative year, and let's say 2010, there were 53 million deaths in the world, about 35 million of those were due to the chronic diseases. Well, what about South Asia? What does it look like in South Asia if I was to draw this same pie chart and we asked, does this distribution change? Well, in most of the countries, it's about 50%. In some countries, a little bit more. So for example, in Bangladesh, it's about 60%. And on the other hand, in Afghanistan, it's about 40%. And that's because Afghanistan still has a considerable unfinished agenda of infectious disease, maternal child mortality. So this is clearly a very relevant problem for South Asia. And we'll see in a few moments that it's going to increasingly be a relevant problem and grow in magnitude. So now let's take and unpack this blue area and ask ourselves, what is in here? And so I'm going to draw a box for us to organize our thinking. And there are 4 main chronic disease clusters that account for a big proportion of what we have here in this blue. And so we'll start by just listing those. So first, we already gave you a hint, that's cardiovascular disease and stroke. Second, chronic lung disease. Third, diabetes. And this refers to childhood diabetes and adult onset diabetes. And fourth, the cancers. Now, that's certainly not all of the chronic diseases, but these 4 account for about 75% of that whole area of blue. Now, I chose a metric, that is deaths, to represent the burden of disease due to these chronic diseases. But what I could have done is chosen a different metric. And I could have chosen a metric that reflects both the risk of premature mortality, but also reflects the impact on quality of life. And one such metric is called the Disability Adjusted Life Year, or the DALY. And you can pursue an exercise on the side that will provide for you to learn more about DALYs. But for now, think of that as a metric instead of deaths that reflects both premature mortality as well as impacting the quality of life, or the years of your life lived with disability. And so if I was to plot this same exact diagram but use DALYs instead of deaths, we would see that not only are these 4 chronic diseases really important, but we have another one that accounts for a substantial portion, and you can probably guess what that is, but that's mental health disorders. So I'd be remiss to not mention the magnitude of the burden due to mental health disorders. And there are, of course, others, musculoskeletal disorders, neurologic disorders, but for today and for the purposes of brevity, I'll write other for now. So why don't we take these 4, and we're going to use the example of the 4 chronic diseases responsible for the majority of deaths to illustrate a couple of the most important features and why those features matter so much, what the implications are. So let's start with shared risk factors. And I'll just draw a little arrow down here. And I'm going to draw another box. And in this box, I'm going to write on the top primary risk factors. And what do I mean by primary risk factors? Well, these are early risk factors well before the disease develops that represent risks for developing that disease. So for example, diet, inactivity, that would be lack of exercise, tobacco, and of course, age, family history, there are others. But there are a few examples of primary risk factors. And we'll circle that. But there's also another set of risk factors, and I'm going to call those intermediate. So I'll jot down intermediate here. And what I mean by intermediate risk factors are these are going to be risk factors for those diseases that we really have to kind of look for in order to see. So for example, increased blood pressure. So you may have no symptoms, but if we look for it, we might find increased blood pressure. Increased blood sugar or glucose, precursor to diabetes. Being overweight or obesity. And these are examples of what I'll refer to as intermediate risk factors. What's important about these risk factors? Well, first of all, if we just look at the primary, I'll introduce a term called primary prevention. So if we could modify diet or inactivity or tobacco use, we could prevent the diseases from developing. Another term I'll introduce right now is secondary prevention. And so someone that already has high blood pressure or high blood sugar may indeed require treatment or medication. However, we can treat them and still prevent the development of more advanced disease. So these are both very important levers we're going to have to tackle the chronic diseases, and that gives you a bit of a warm-up for what lies ahead. What about the second feature that these have? And I'm going to just choose the long latency as the second example to highlight. And I'll draw an arrow down here to illustrate what I mean. And let me remind you, we're talking about this cluster of diseases and the risk factors associated with them. And so if I was to ask you to imagine a lifetime, so I'm going to draw a line right across the bottom here, and I'll write prenatal or in utero way on the left, and here I'll just jot down adolescence, here adult, and I'll just write elder. And we won't exactly put corresponding ages to those, so use your imagination. But if we are to think of a life course risk, these risk factors really accumulate over time. And it's the cumulative risk and the cumulative exposure and the time that it takes to develop these risk factors that results in what we can expect in terms of the burden of disease in the population. So that's kind of important. If we step back and we think about this picture, there's a couple of observations we can make. So first, if we look over here, if we had some sense of what the levels of diet and inactivity and tobacco use were, and some sense of the levels of high blood pressure, etc., we could predict and have a sense of what the magnitude of that burden will be in a particular population. So let's think about South Asia as an example. If I was to ask you to consider or do an exercise after you watch this to look at the average blood pressure in the South Asian countries, you might be surprised to see that it's about 30% of the population, give or take 5%, in all of the South Asian countries that have elevated blood pressure. If we just think of just Pakistan, and I'll just write that as an example, nearly 1 in 10 also, in addition to high blood pressure, have a high blood sugar. If I then tell you that about 1 in 3 or 4 males have smoked or are current smokers over the age of 15, this is giving you a picture of quite a large burden over the future in the population. That's a great moment for us to just for a second consider the local context and the global context. When you think of these risk factors and diseases over a lifetime, you can imagine that the circumstances under which you live, economic, political, social, for example, your access to fresh food and the ability to have a healthy diet, rapid urbanization, are you walking or are you driving to work? Do you get exercise? Your exposure to pollution or secondary smoke, all of those things, those circumstances of your daily life, the local context will have a big impact on what the magnitude of these risk factors are. Second, for a moment, let's think of the global context. So big picture, why are there these high rates of these risk factors already in many of the low-income or low-middle-income countries? Well, one reason is the global transfer of risks. So when we think back to those global dynamics and the transfer of risks across borders, that is one hint as to how the global context is impacting this picture in Pakistan, but more broadly in the South Asian countries. So that's the bad news, because it's a pretty sobering fact, but there's good news. And the good news is that this long period gives us lots of opportunities to intervene. And if we can intervene in those earlier stages, we can make an enormous impact on that ultimate burden. So now let's turn to the third section of this module, where we'll talk about the different ways we can tackle these problems, and we'll capitalize on this long trajectory to look at different moments of opportunity that we can make a difference in the population.